office in the Commons, where he works as Leader of the House. So let's get down to business and try and start in this way, which is that if we reproved the Chinese for their behaviour in relation to Hong Kong, and they pleaded difficult and highly exceptional circumstances, what would our response to that be?
Our response to what is going on in Hong Kong in relation to the joint declaration is that the Chinese did a deal to maintain the liberties of Hong Kong for 50 years, and that they are eroding the liberties of the people of Hong Kong. They are cheating on a deal. And we are entitled to point that out, and we're entitled to take measures to protect the people of Hong Kong. Is why we've offered a route to citizenship for British nationals overseas who live in Hong Kong, who have a right to expect support from the British government. That's what we're doing. That's surely the right thing to do.
The question that comes back is we've also signed a treaty. We signed a withdrawal agreement last year. And now, in this UK internal market bill that will come before the Commons this week, we want to resile from certain clauses in it that we signed and agreed only last year.
Well, I think that's an uncharacteristic simplification of the situation. I'm rather surprised at Conservative Pen ever simplifying in such a way. What is being done is an emergency protection in case the EU is outrageously unreasonable. So, there is a joint committee which will deal with goods going from GB to Northern Ireland, and which ones are at risk, and which ones therefore may need to have some direct declarations around them before going to Northern Ireland in case they go into the Republic. However, there is the risk that the EU has raised in the negotiations. So it's come from the EU, it's not a phantasm evolving from the mind of our political leaders, that they might say that food exports from GB to Northern Ireland would not be permitted under the terms of the agreement. And what is being done is taking a reserve power to ensure that can be done, that we can carry on providing food. So Tesco's in GB can export food to Tesco's in Northern Ireland to ensure that Tesco's shelves are full, and other supermarkets likewise will want to do the same thing, want to be able to do the same thing, because the agreement recognises the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom in a different part, and it recognises that Northern Ireland is part of the customs union of the United Kingdom in a different part, but the EU does potentially have an ability to stop food going from GB to Northern Ireland. And what is being done is legislating to prevent that from happening by giving powers to the UK government to override the treaty if the treaty were interpreted in that way. So you say to me, why go out on a limb and say this could be a technical and narrow breach of international law, rather than arguing that actually, because it would require a breach of good faith within the treaties, it's a perfectly reasonable response. And the reason for that is that the courts need to interpret UK law as UK law and not get involved in matters of international law. We want this settled under our own law, not international law, so that what Parliament says will be clear and determinative, and the courts won't be able to say, well, Parliament can't have meant this because it would be in breach of international law. So it narrows down any risk of legal challenge to the clarity of what the UK government would do to protect the supply of food, for example, to Northern Ireland.
Let's just go back for a moment, and you've explained that these safeguarding measures need to come in. The reason for that, is it not, is that we are concerned that the courts would reach judgments that, were not in the government's view in favour of the national interests on tariffs, or on the applicability of state aid provisions that apply in Northern Ireland and Great Britain. The reason that has happened is because the withdrawal agreement that we negotiated has left open that possibility.
Well, I think crucially, the withdrawal agreement was ratified by an Act of Parliament, and the Act of Parliament included Section 38, and Section 38 gave primacy to UK law. And the EU accepted our means of ratification. So therefore, they accepted the Act of Parliament which gave supremacy to UK law. So this is completely in line with the way in which we ratified the treaty. And that's something I think has been overlooked during these recent discussions. But in any treaty, well, let's go back to the Treaty of Utrecht. The Treaty of Utrecht gave us, among other things, Gibraltar. And it gave us Gibraltar as a cannon shot, as I understand it, from the high point in towards the Spanish mainland. Well, you could argue, I suppose, that you could go and get a very large cannon now and fire it a good deal further than you could have done in the early 18th century. And therefore, if you were to look back at the Treaty of Utrecht, you could discover we were allowed to have a little bit more land rather than a little bit less, as the Spanish might like. But that wouldn't be within the spirit of the treaty, even if it might be in the legal wording. But there are also, in the Treaty of Utrecht, pieces of international law we've been ignoring for probably centuries, because it prohibits anybody of the Jewish faith from living in Gibraltar. But we don't take any notice. So international law is part of the relationships between states. It is not open to a single interpretation nor the clarity with which domestic law has, nor does it have a court that can give final rulings on it in the same way. The Vienna Convention on the International Court being able to rule on disputes between international bodies and sovereign nations has never been ratified. So there isn't this clarity, there is opinion. And what the government is trying to do is to narrow this down so that in UK law it is quite clear that what is determined by Parliament and government is the law, and in the UK it is not open to further challenge within the UK courts. And that seems quite right, because the best law is the clearest law, so that you don't then leave it open to judges to have to interpret what Parliament may have meant. What Parliament will have meant will be perfectly clear.
Now, let's accept, for whatever reason, we need these safeguarding measures in the event of no deal. The question really is, why have we put ourselves in the position where Brandon Lewis got to his feet in the Commons last week and said that in a certain very limited way we will be breaking international law by resigning from the withdrawal agreement, when the Prime Minister wrote in the Daily Telegraph over the weekend, it's backed up by David Frost on Twitter yesterday, that the EU is threatening a food blockade of Great Britain. Surely, in this event, the EU would be breaking international law, not the UK.
But just because the EU might be breaking international law wouldn't necessarily mean that any action taken in response to that would de facto be within international law.
It wouldn't necessarily mean it, but the distinguished Eurosceptic lawyer Martin Howe, and I believe the ERG, are arguing that there's nothing illegal about what we would be doing.
But the point that I was trying to make is that if, before legislating, the government says this may be in breach of international law, when it gets to the Supreme Court can't cast it aside and say, well, this is in breach of international law, therefore it's not valid, because Parliament will knowingly have legislated to override international law. And Parliament is the supreme sovereign authority in this country. And the courts could not therefore override a statute that had been passed explicitly acknowledging that it might be in breach of international law. You can then argue whether it is in breach of international law or not, and I've got a lot of sympathy for Martin Howe's point of view.
I entirely get the point about wishing to send a very clear message to the domestic courts. Wouldn't the political context have been easier if the negotiation falls apart, the EU can legitimately be argued to be acting in bad faith, they try a food blockade, they're arguably in breach of the rather ambiguous Northern Ireland Protocol? You could have just rushed a bill through the Commons then to do the safeguarding.
Do you think so? Do you think so? If you look at the opposition that's come to this bill from all the same people who backed Remain before, If you brought it in December, then the House of Lords would effectively have a veto on this bill. You could not rush it through and be certain of getting it through the House of Lords. Just look at, they've all come out of the woodwork. Tony Blair's come out of the woodwork. He was always a great recruiting sergeant for Brexiteers, but out he comes, that great respecter of international law himself. You know, he paid great attention to it throughout his political career. Always a man of the highest standards in this regard. He has spoken. He himself has spoken. We would have had all that, and we would have had very little time to do it. The job of governments surely is to prepare for events, not just to react to events, and this is sensible preparation.
We will make America great again.